point of order. I have a bit of a cough, so if at any point I just descend into coughing, don't worry, I'll be back. Like I won't go for too long. But can I pray one more time before we get started? I want to pray as we turn to God's word. So, dear Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for just what a joy it is to study your word, to look at it deeply, Lord, and to be changed by it. Lord, I pray tonight that everything I say from here would honor and glorify you, Lord, that you would keep me from any error, Lord, that your Spirit would guide my words as you've intended. Lord, I pray that you would draw a straight line in all of our hearts from our affection for you, our love for you, and what that means for how we spend our money, Lord, and how we use the gifts you've given us. In your name, amen. America is addicted to debt. I mean, we show all the symptoms. We completely lack control. In 2018, a study found that the average American household has about $38,000 of debt, excluding mortgages. So this is we're not even looking at housing payments. We're looking at just people's personal debt. And moreover, this has increased $1,000 from last year alone. Most of this spending is purely discretionary. 50% of this debt fits into one of three categories: dining/nightlife, clothing/personal care, and personal hobbies. And in spite of all this, we're only going further into debt. One of the people who ran this study described it this way. They said, despite recognizing that debt is dangerous waters, Americans are jumping in with both feet and struggling to stay afloat. We know that debt is a bad idea, and yet we can't help ourselves. But not only do we lack control, but we're ignoring the risk factors. In 2008, America endured one of the largest financial recessions in recent memory, and most of us can't even describe how it happened. In brief, I'll put it this way: a lot of people wanted homes that couldn't afford homes, and the bank said, I don't care if you can't pay this mortgage. Here's a mortgage anyway. And they turned around and sold the mortgage to the banks, and then the banks listed it on their books as an asset, as something good. Well, when you give mortgages to people who can't pay mortgages, they can't pay mortgages. So all of these people defaulted on their home loans, and the entire financial market crashed. The greatest crash in our nation's history began in 1929, when thousands and thousands of Americans woke up to find out that this stock market that they'd been told would never crash, crashed, and they lost all of their money. And yet somehow we're surprised about once every generation when it crashes. We see it happen over and over again, and we ignore the risk factors. And to top it all off, we keep constantly increasing our dosage. In spite of all of the debt that Americans have acquired, we just want more. The American wealth, the wealth of America, increased $13.5 trillion in 2020 in spite of the pandemic, and Americans are more miserable than ever. The happiness industry, which is literally an industry where people pay money to be happy, is valued at $10 billion right now. Remember that 15% of debt that was for personal care? A lot of that is for the happiness industry. People are going into debt to try and be happy, to pay people to make them more happy. That's the level at which we're at in America. And Solomon is no stranger to the temptation to skip a step in our financial ladder through debt. And he's going to warn his son against this temptation. So let's flip over to Proverbs 6. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5. So Proverbs 6, we're beginning a series. In my Bible, the heading says practical warnings. So we're beginning a section on Solomon's practical warnings to his son. So we'll read just verses 1 through 5. Solomon says, "My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, caught in the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. For you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, hasten, and plead urgently with your neighbor. Give your eyes no sleep, and your eyelids no slumber. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of a hunter, like a bird from the hand of a fowler." And I think it's helpful when we're looking at practical wisdom. Practical wisdom isn't usually the teaching we hear here. Most often we hear teaching that is just an exposition of the gospel and Christ's work, and that's great. Like, I need that all the time. But it's helpful to remember why we're looking at practical wisdom at Proverbs. And to explain this, I can think of no better person to steal words from than Alex Haregrove. When I called Dan earlier this week to talk about this lesson, Alex was eavesdropping and felt the need to share these words with me, and I'm glad he did. And this is a rough quote. It's not exactly what he said, but I think it was helpful. He said, "The same God who made you and saved you also made his creation to work in a certain way. And it's a good thing to know what that way is." So as we look at Solomon's exposition on Proverbs and on debt and finances, we're looking at the way God made his world to work, and we're also looking at some of the ways in which that's broken by sin, and we need to be aware of that. As Christians living in this world, it quite literally pays to be wise with our money. And Jesus commands us to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves as we go out into the world. It would be foolish to ignore the words of the wisest man ever in Jesus Christ and the second wisest man ever in Solomon as we go out into the world. But one more thing before I get started, really looking into this passage, is that this isn't going to make any sense yet if you have not taken the first step in the fear of the Lord. If you're not pursuing Christ, this is going to make zero sense. I'm going to say stuff like, you should spend less money on yourself, and not in like this hipstery, minimalist, Marie Kondo approved kind of way. Like you should give money to people who are going to leave it all behind and go live in the middle of nowhere and share the gospel that you love with people you won't meet this side of heaven. You should make investments like that. Maybe even you should do something as crazy as pull your retirement savings early and take a penalty so you can go be one of those people. That's the kind of life that Christians should live. That's wise in sight of the gospel, but that's foolishness to the world. So if your main concern is what the world thinks is wise or how you can better achieve financial stability so you can live a more comfortable life, that's not what we're looking at here. To look at wisdom this way, you have to first love Christ. You have to love the God who saw you while you were sinful, not just financially unwise, but just living in sin, who took on the flesh of his own creation, lived a perfect life, died on the cross for your sin, and paid the far greater debt that you owe him, which is the debt of your sin. So if you don't first love that, then, man, take the next 30 minutes and think about that. Like, go read John, and then we can talk again after. But for believers, I think we should look at this weird currency thing that God has instituted in our lives. So we're going to split this. I'm going to split this verse into two by means of a roadmap. We're going to split it into two parts. Solomon's making an argument here, and he's making an if-then statement. So he's saying, if A, then B. It's pretty simple. So we're going to dig into the if statement first. He's going to look at just the first two verses here. So let's reread those. Verses 1 and 2, Solomon says, "My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, if you are caught in the words of your mouth." And breaking down this verse, we're going to look at the who of this verse. We're going to look at three people Solomon is cautioning his son against engaging in debt with. But first off, we're going to look at everyone's favorite subject, which is Near Eastern debt practices. Because the ESV has an interesting way of translating this. It's kind of unique. It almost is like this weird, it reminds me of a Dr. Seuss rhyme, to be honest. This, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have given your pledge for a stranger, like a little orange man on a tree stump is telling me this. But what this putting up security actually is referring to is this practice of becoming a surety. And see, in Solomon's day, you didn't just enter into debt. You didn't just go to a bank and be like, here's a loan. I need a loan to start a small business or something else. If you needed a loan, you brought this other guy in with you, and that was your surety. You went to the other guy and said, hey, I'm going to pay you back this money, but if I can't pay you back this money, this guy is going to pay it back. He'll be good for me. We kind of have something like this with co-signers, but it's just not as common. This was their means of going into debt. Now, it's a little bit different for us. I realize that for you guys, like, becoming a surety is not necessarily number one on your list of temptations. Like, you're not going to go out and co-sign a debt for each other tomorrow. But I think if we look a little bit deeper at Proverbs, if we look at a lot of Solomon's other references to debt in Proverbs, it's going to kind of expose a little more of what he's talking about. If we look at Proverbs 26, he says, Be not one of those who gives pledges, who put up security for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should your bed be taken from under you? The issue here Solomon is drawing out is the temptation to overextend financially, seeking gain. It's the same attitude that they talk about, that James talks about in James 4. He says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And that's often what it looks like for us. We go into debt, we take on debt, we make unwise financial decisions, we invest poorly, we engage in shady practices because we're looking for some shortcut to profit. And Solomon continues to warn against this. In Proverbs 28:22, he says, a stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. The pursuit of wealth alone will always end in tragedy. So, while suretyship may not always be our temptation, Solomon's principles here still apply to our lives. And I'll use debt as a shorthand a lot tonight, simply because I don't want to list out a list of transactions every time. We would be here for all night. But essentially, debt in this context, it can mean, hey, you're going into debt, you're pulling out a bunch of debt, you're overspending on your credit card. It can mean, hey, I'm making a bunch of risky investments in the stock market because somebody on the internet told me to. It can mean, hey, like I'm not paying my taxes. It can mean any sort of financial decisions that are based purely around what can I do to make me happy. That's the lack of wisdom that Solomon's warning against. So Solomon's going to warn us against a few different individuals here in verses 1 and 2. And these three represent a regression we're familiar with. He's going to warn us about friends, about strangers, and then about hunters, or those who would seek to do us financial harm. First, we talk about friends. He says, don't become a surety for your neighbor or your friend, somebody you know. And this may seem to strike us a little funny because we want to be generous. But one of the pastors I listened to talk about this passage, Brian Myers, he said it this way. Do you want to know the definition of a distant friend? A friend who owes you money that they can't pay. I know a man personally who, falling into a youthful debt, once avoided someone for years because they were so afraid that if they spent a bunch of time around this person, they'd remember that they owed them money, and then they'd have to pay them back with shame as interest. But anyone who's been there knows this, that money is divisive, especially when shared among believers. And I'll happily acknowledge that we all come from different financial backgrounds, and we may have a different idea of what debt is in our minds, but I want to assure you this, that debt shared among members of the church is absolutely toxic, just as the temptation to turn the church into a profit-rich environment. I'm not saying never help other believers. Please don't hear me, and I want to get to that more later. But I want to offer you two questions when it comes to offering debt or offering a loan to someone you know. And that is, first, examine your heart. Examine, first of all, the means God has given you, and examine your willingness to part with this money. First of all, Paul tells believers in Timothy, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So Paul's establishing sort of like this hierarchy here, right? That we need to be aware of what God has given us and avoid the temptation to think that God is not aware of what he's given you financially and that maybe you should have had a little bit more. God knows what he gave you. He knows how you can give money to others. He blessed you for that reason. But acknowledge the limits on yourself. You're to provide for relatives, especially those in your house. Listen, if you have people that are dependent on you, even if they're not living with you, you need to provide for them. That's a commandment in Scripture. That's something you need to do. And listen, the people that live in your house, you're one of those people. So you need to be providing for yourself, because if you're just giving away a bunch of money and then you turn around and other believers have to come and bail you out, you're part of the problem. So you're to be wise with what God has given you. You're also to examine your own heart. Before you give money to somebody, examine, hey, am I going to be bitter towards this person? if they don't pay me back in the length of time I want them to, or the way I want them to, or if I see that maybe I give a loan to another believer who's starting a business and they start to make a profit and the first thing he does is not pay me back, am I going to be bitter towards them? Examine your heart. Think about that. Because if the answer is yes, then maybe it's not a good idea to give at this point or give them a loan. But if the answer to both is yes, in the sense that, yes, I have the means with which to give another believer this money, to give them a loan, and yes, I'm not going to be embittered against them, then I have a better option than a loan. And that's just give them the money. Like, if you have the means, if God has given you the means, don't attach these strings to it. Don't tell other believers, hey, here's this money, but I'd like it back in a year. No, God has given it to you to be shared among the church. Don't hold tight to it yourself. But Solomon doesn't just say don't borrow or give money from friends. His next point is directed at strangers. In other words, don't take stuff from people you don't know. I imagine some of you have probably heard of Klarna. I heard about it at Christmas. They ran like a series of awful ads that just like bombarded you all the time. But it fascinated me. I almost like used them to buy a shirt for this sermon because I thought it would be a good illustration, but I ran out of time. So instead, I just went on their website and read about them. And it's fascinating. Like, this service, if you've not heard of it, their whole purpose is to offer you the ability to go into debt for anything. Anything can now be reduced to 4 easy payments, paid every other week. And bear in mind, this is a company that takes your bank account info when you buy something. So if you don't make a payment, it's because there's nothing there. And if you don't make a payment, it's just a $7 late fee for every missed payment. And hey, they write this with all the earnestness, all the kind earnestness of a stone statue. Late fees will never exceed 25% of your order total. You see, the issue here is it's never been easier to go into debt for even the smallest of things. And Klarna or any of these other services, they don't care about you. They want you to think they care about you. They want to seem like, hey, we're nice. We're not going to charge you too much. It's going to be easy. They don't care about you. Solomon was the second wisest man in the world. I think he would shudder if he saw the extent to which debt has integrated itself into our lives. It's utterly inescapable, and we wouldn't dream of shaking hands with 99% of the people that hold our debt. We've become so accustomed to it that every decade an overabundance of debt causes a financial crash, and we just go right back to it. And in one sense, Solomon's caution here stems from the same principle. You have no bearing on how a stranger will act. I mean, we hope we do. We hope Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to stick to the terms of their agreement, but they don't care if your car breaks down or you have medical bills. Contrary to a friend, they just want their money, and they want it when they told you they want it. And I understand the risk is in one sense lower than that. They're not malicious, but they want their money. And when we're so eager to place our faith in others and in a future we do not know nor have control of, it's worth examining our hearts. And when entering debt, I think the vital question to ask ourselves is why? Because I don't want you to hear this is just that if you have any debt at all, you're in sin. I'm not Dave Ramsey. It's okay. Like, there will be points in your life where there's okay debt. But I believe that in this present age, and I hesitate anytime I say the words in this present age, that there are circumstances when debt may be a practical option. For many, college is not an option without some form of student loans. Or maybe a car, transportation for a job is not an option without a car loan. And in this area, owning a home is just pure fantasy without a mortgage. Like, this is just not going to happen. So I don't condemn all debt. But I think a key part of Solomon's caution here is stop and think before you just go start borrowing money and solving everything with 4 easy payments. Why am I taking out this debt? But we're not quite done yet. We're not quite to the practical portion, because there's one more person we're to avoid, and it's the hunter. It's the one who seeks to do you harm. And you see the theme come around in verse 2 when it talks about being snared by the words of your mouth. You see these just trap motifs sort of come up. And to be sure, notice it says snared in the words of your mouth. In every debt transaction, you bring at least 50% to the table. Like, you're bringing your words and your commitment to the table. But in verse 5, you see this really come around again when he talks about saving yourself like a gazelle from the hand of a hunter or the bird from the hand of a fowler. There are people out there who would seek to do you financial harm for their own financial gain. And I wondered how far to go into this point, and then I remembered that the college students are home right now, and there is no point in your life where you are going to face this like when you're in college. Like, this is a problem for all of you, but I remember when I was in college, you have student credit cards with terrible interest rates, student loans that can be structured very poorly. You have pyramid schemes and the temptations of rampant consumerism like you have never experienced in your life before. And all of them are not good. I once had a multi-day discussion with a roommate that I was living with at the time about joining a multi-level marketing corporation. He had like the trifecta of college expenses. He had tuition to pay, he had a car that was just an absolute lemon and always breaking down, and he had a long-term girlfriend. So he was like, if anyone needed money, this dude needed money. And some dude walked up to him in a store and was like, hey, you look like you could use a business opportunity. The guy was like dressed real nice, and he's like, let me set up a meeting with you. So they did. They set up a meeting, and they went out to breakfast or something, and he pitched him on this. He's like, hey, if you just give me a little money, then we can get started, and we'll start moving, and I'll start giving you product to sell, and you just give me a little more money, and your business opportunities are gonna keep growing. And that is just not how that works. Anything that says, give me money on the ground floor, it's just not how that works. There's a variety of these companies. We refer to them usually as multi-level marketing. It's a kind word of saying it's a pyramid scheme. And they really target the church. Like, if you haven't seen this, these companies come for the church because they find out that if you can get a Christian to start looking at the rest of the church as a profit-rich environment instead of brothers and sisters in Christ, then, man, you got them. And they'll pay you all the money because they'll start to see a little profit out of it. There are going to be so many opportunities in your life that are not going to pay anything close to what they promise. So be wary. When Jesus sends his disciples out, I referenced it, I'm going to keep saying this. He tells them, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And this applies to the way we spend our money. A Christian who is as shrewd as a snake and innocent as a dove helps other believers generously. They support them with their time, their effort, and their money, but never in such a way that would put the other believer in a difficult position if things don't work out exactly as expected. A Christian who is as shrewd as a snake and innocent as a dove may carry a house loan so they can exercise hospitality, or student debt because they need a degree in pursuit of what God has given them. But they don't take that house loan and buy a mansion, and they don't go major in something that's never going to make them any money and return on that investment. A Christian who is as shrewd as a snake and innocent as a dove isn't in this life to make a quick profit. Other believers are not an easy-to-reach demographic, and money is never to be pursued over Christ. Solomon has taken such great pains to eliminate all of our options. He goes through all the ways you can go into debt. Don't be loaning money or taking money from your friends or your relatives. Hey, be wary when you go to a stranger, somebody you don't know, and be watchful for people that want to take financial advantage of you. And debt is so easy in this present age. Like, hey, if you don't feel good, buy something. It'll be here in 48 hours or less. If you feel good about something, buy it. It'll be here in 48 hours or less. It's how we mark our life stages. Your first job, your first paycheck, your first car, your first promotion, your first house. And we're constantly looking to our left and right to see, have we kept track with everyone else that's making the same amount of money? Are we comfortable enough? Are we living in enough luxury? Do we have enough status? And this pursuit of money makes us look foolish, no matter how much money you make. There was a study recently that said, your happiness maxes out at $120,000. Beyond that, people just don't get any happier because of the money they have. And listen, Jeff Bezos looks just as foolish for spending his entire life in the pursuit of money and then losing half of it because he divorced his wife to go after another man's wife and then blows billions more on a space race with other billionaires as the guy who stands on the street corner and complains because he won't work and never has any money. The pursuit of money has a way of making us all look foolish, no matter where we are. And Solomon's saying there's going to be people your whole life that are just going to say, hey, if you loan me some money now, I'll be good for it. Or, hey, if you give me some money, I'll give you back triple what you give me. Or if you give me some money, you can earn triple back what you give me. Or, hey, whatever you want, Just pay for it later. You can take it now. Just pay for it whenever you want. And it's so dangerous. Recently, I'll be honest, I was caught up in some of this stock trading that's going on. If you're not paying attention to it, what's happened is people on the internet have figured out that enough of them band together, they can control the price of stocks. They can go for these worthless stocks, these companies that are going bankrupt, that are not doing so well, and they can all buy in and make the price of the stock go up. And I've always kept a little money in the stock market, and I'll be honest, like, it got me. I was like, you know what, I'll sell what I've got. I always have these like slow earning companies that are just solid investments, they grow. I was like, that's boring. I'm buying whatever's next. And I did. I like dumped all of the good stock and just bought some super cheap stock. And like 2 days in, I walk out of the office and I go over to Ashley Rose and I'm like, I just made $50 today. I was so proud of I'm like Warren Buffett or something. I just made $50. And Ashley Rose just looks at me, and I'm very blessed. She just goes, did you sell it? No, I didn't sell it. It's still going up. Why would I sell it? She's like, well, then you didn't make $50. You don't have anything. It's not going to go down overnight. It went down overnight. Went down really quickly. And I lost money. I'm still losing money. Actively, as I stand up here, I'm probably losing money on this transaction. Don't buy it. It's not going to work. You can't make a quick buck just feeding off of this. But there's this frenzy, this like mind thing that says, I want it. Never in our lives has it been easier to see other people making money. The whole reason I went in is you just hear about all these people that have made money overnight investing in this. I mean, heck, like these days, all you have to do is open up your computer and you're looking at like teenagers who have made hundreds of thousands of dollars by making videos on YouTube. It's never been easier to be aware of what we don't have and how much we want it. So the point here is stop making your financial decisions purely based on how much you can get out of it. Solomon says, do not be one of those who gives pledges, who puts up security for debts. Remember, if you have nothing with which to pay, why should your bed be taken from underneath you? It's just not good life practice. But even more than that, it's just not good stewardship. Consider the perspective of Solomon writing to his son. Solomon's son is going to get a fair amount of money. In Ecclesiastes 2:22, Solomon writes, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill himself must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. His son is going to get a lot of money. Our own condition is far more blessed. We're not inheriting a lot of money. We're inheriting the righteousness of Christ through his sacrifice. We get so much more. We get to then carry out his mission here on earth. And one of the blessings of Christian life is to be able to use the resources God has given us to carry out that mission. John Piper refers to this as the wartime living mentality. The idea that as believers, we're living in a war and souls are at stake. And we should be living like citizens lived in World War II, for instance. To illustrate this, he refers to the ocean liner, the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was the queen of comfort. Like, this was the best comfort liner money could buy before World War II. It was just the lap of luxury. Everyone wanted it. Well, World War II rolls around, and this needs to be a troop transport. So what happens is it's stripped down. Everything is stripped down to the bare bones. A room that would have had like 1 or 2 people, it now sleeps 12. The dining hall, the luxurious dining room, is now a mess hall. Like the decks that people would have sunned out on and just relaxed on, they're now used for storing munitions and supplies. But you know what it was doing? It was fulfilling its purpose. When it was that troop transport, it was fulfilling its purpose. How just useless would it have been if that thing landed on the European shores and off-rolled 20% of the troops that they were promised? And everyone's standing around saying, well, where are the rest of the troops? They're like, well, it just would have been uncomfortable to bring them. And it's more comfortable this way. So what I'm not saying is that going into debt is always wrong, but ask yourself why. Are you preferring comfort over the mission of the gospel? Taking out student debt to work hard at a skill God has given you? Yes, make that investment. Let that investment return dividends for that mission. But taking out a car loan on your 5-year-old car because it's just not as much fun as it was when you bought it, well, why? You're at war first of all, with your own love of the flesh and comfort. And two, you're at a war for souls. Don't take the resources God has given you out of the fight for a car payment that you don't need. You don't have to live in abject poverty all your life. Far from it. God blesses some financially more than others. But don't rob yourself of the joy of participating in the mission of the gospel because of what you want, because you're going to tie up all your finances in debt. But say you have. Solomon's next portion. We've covered the if. Don't go into debt. Well then, what if you have? Well, what do we do? Say you have student debt, or you loaned a bunch of money to some ne'er-do-well family member, or your house payment is way bigger than what you thought it would be when you got that mortgage, or, maybe you lost all your money investing in GameStop. What then? What then? And Solomon has laid out a game plan for getting out of debt. It's called work really hard. His first words of wisdom are, then, do this, my son, and save yourself. And note the stakes here. Do this and save yourself. Not do this and here's 10 steps so you can get out of debt mildly faster. No, do this and save yourself now. For if you have come into the hand of your neighbor, go, hasten, and plead urgently with your neighbor. Think about the context of this passage. So this is the context is you are the surety. Your friend has borrowed a bunch of money and he said, hey, if I can't pay this back, he's got it. He's got my debt. And so you're on the hook for this. Solomon's saying, if you're on the hook, if this is you, go to your neighbor and plead urgently with him. Make sure he pays that back. Don't give him any rest. Verses 4 and 5 say, give your eyelids no sleep and your eyes no slumber. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Listen, if you are presently in violation of any financial regulation or tax law or just good taste by not paying someone back, Solomon is imploring you to see the urgency of your situation. If you owe people money, you are quite literally like a gazelle in the hand of a hunter. You were prey. Now you're just game. Like you've been caught. All that remains is the hand to close. Do you know that half of the US population right now is carrying credit card debt? This isn't like I have a credit card bill that I will pay off when the bill comes in. This is I'm carrying debt month to month. And this is alarming because credit card debt is one of the worst debts. Credit cards often charge in excess of 10% on interest, and that's like really high. To understand why this is so alarming, if you are making minimum payments on a large amount of credit card debt, even if you don't charge that credit card for the whole year, you will owe more on that credit card bill at the end of the year than when you started. Because that interest is going to increase more than your minimum payments. If you've never been exposed to Dave Ramsey, then let me share with you one of the little joys in my life. If you have, I heard an oh no. I think I've made my opinion on Dave Ramsey clear, but just for the record, Dave Ramsey is always against debt. For some people, that can be wise. If you struggle with debt, that can be a wise thing to do. I think that that's not always the case. There's instances in which, and I've explained, that there's debt that can be helpful to believers. But this sage of anti-debt advice will sometimes open the phones on his radio show. And people call in expecting, I don't know, something other than don't go into debt. But they always call in with these scenarios. It's like, hey, I've accumulated about $300,000 in student debt pursuing my lifelong dream of being a physical therapist. And I just got engaged, and my fiance and I are planning just a modest $80,000 wedding, and I just bought a new car. What do I do? And for all of Dave Ramsey's sort of predictability, I think his advice is actually pretty predictably good in this situation. It lines up with this passage really well. When people call and he says, hey, listen, your life is now going to be primarily engaged in paying off this debt. So you're going to sell what you can afford to sell, and then you're going to reevaluate and you're going to sell some more. You're also going to reevaluate what you think your standard of living should be. You're going to not eat out at all. You're going to learn to cook a lot of beans and rice. If you have a good job, you're going to work really hard at it. If you don't, the first step is go out and get a good job. Your life is now largely devoted outside of church and ministry to working to pay off this debt. And because there's always a but at the end, Dave Ramsey will always sit there and jot out and calculate on this piece of paper how long he thinks it'll take this person to get out of debt. But at the end of that, he always says, then you're free to go and spend your money how you want to. But I'd say you're free to once again use the full resources God has given you to glorify him. So what? Why do this? In other words, why does all this matter? I know I haven't been completely bereft of application up until this point, but I want to drive this home. Don't just accumulate wealth to get out of debt and live financially wisely so you can spend it all on yourself. It doesn't do you 1 ounce of good to get out of debt and just spend all this money on yourself. I think Jesse made this point really well in his sermon on Sunday on Ephesians 5. He talked about the trajectory of the believer's life, that we're to go from stealing, and if you're borrowing money that you can't pay back, you're stealing. If you're not paying your taxes, you're stealing. If you're just being super speculative with all of your investments and taking a bunch of chances, at the very least, you're stealing God's money and using it for yourself. So we go from this place of stealing to a place of working and ultimately to giving. That's a sign of maturity in a believer's life, that we work towards giving back. Paul doesn't mince words when he writes to believers who are wealthy. And we're not all wealthy, especially by American standards. I know that that's not the case, but in the case of the global church, we have more to give than many other believers. He says in 1 Timothy 6:17 and 19, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, be rich in good works, and be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. If we're truly at war, then in America, too often we act like, well, America. Prior to entering World War II, we're just sitting on the sidelines and throwing our old and outdated goods at the front lines. Instead, we should participate in this war fully, like we really believe that souls are at stake. I mean, you can't buy a soul, but you can fund the translation of the Bible into new languages. You can buy Bibles to be given out. You can fund students to receive a Christian education when they're the first person in their family to go to school. There are so many ways you can give to just incredible works of the gospel. I mean, there's a missionary at Emmanuel whose mission is like to fly planes to deliver supplies to the front lines of missionaries. If there's not a mission to get excited about, can we at least get excited about that? Get excited about this stuff. The gospel is going forth like it never has before. Find ways to invest in it if you're not going to go. It's a huge blessing. And at the same time, please, if you're giving money, make sure that it's going to a gospel ministry. There's lots of secular nonprofits that will take your money to give out bread. And what's it getting people? Sure, they're not hungry anymore, but they're just as spiritually empty as they were before. I love Pastor Charles from African New Life. He talks about the two hands of the gospel in his ministry, that they give people bread. They don't look at people and say, you should believe in Jesus. All right, goodbye. They give them the means they need, and then they give them the gospel. That missions works with those two hands. So find gospel-centered missions to invest in. We're not guaranteed tomorrow, and that's part of what makes the pursuit of debt so wrong. So we don't know how much longer we'll be this financially profitable in America. But let's use the time we have to invest our money and our resources in the gospel. And as a means of just sort of examining your own life, I think C.S. Lewis had a really great metric. People always asked him about, like, how should we live as believers? What should we do with our money? How do we know that we're giving in a good measure? And C.S. Lewis said this, that he believes you should, if you're making a certain amount of money, look at your coworkers. Is your life any different? Is your standard of living exactly the same as all the non-believers that make exactly the same amount of money as you? Not to be legalistic about it or, say, hey, I need to have 500 fewer square feet in my house and my car needs to have 10,000 more miles on it. No, does your life really look different because you believe in the gospel? Do you actually spend your money any differently than people who don't believe that Jesus came and died for your sins? But I also warn on the other side of adopting a mentality that claims some twisted form of legalism in an attempt to curry favor with God. I'm sure you've heard like stories of these pastors who are just racked with guilt over all the money they earn, and they just give it away, and they feel they need to constantly tell people about how much money they're giving away and how poor they are now. That's also not what God commands. You can't buy God's love with your money. God's love is not bought or sold. The debt you owe God was paid for in the blood of Christ for every single believer. And it bears ending with this, that financial wisdom will always be a pipe dream for people who don't have the work of Christ in their lives. If you've not first come to Christ, if you've not first given your life to him, then, you can make Elon Musk's level of money. You're still going to shoot cars into space because you just don't know what to do with it. You can live debt-free in a perfectly minimalistic lifestyle surrounded by white walls and well-pruned succulents. It doesn't matter. If you're living without Christ, debt is only one of the ways in which sin will manifest itself in your life. Solomon says it this way: riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. If you don't have the righteousness of Christ, because listen, much like money, you can't accrue enough righteousness to pay for the wrath of God justly poured out on your sin. You can't do it. There's no amount of righteousness we can acquire that's going to pay for that. Only through Christ can we say, like Charles Wesley in his hymn, "Arise, my soul, arise," before the throne my surety stands. My name is written on his hands. Speaking of Christ, that only through Christ can we say, there's the one who can pay the actual debt I owe. And he's standing before the Father, and his righteousness pays for my sin. His death and his blood pay for my sin. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for your good gifts that you've poured out on us far more richly than we deserve. Lord, I thank you first and foremost for Christ. I thank you for his death, his resurrection, Lord, his blood that pays for our sin. I thank you that in spite of ourselves, Lord, you've blessed us all to live in this time and blessed us with resources. But I pray that you would make us wise to expend those resources in a way that shows our love for you. Lord, that puts forward the gospel as primary in our lives and seeks to spread it as far as we can. In your name, amen. I don't think we have the projectors on, but Michael Sigsby is going to text out the discussion questions to the Funtivities group chat. So if no one in your group is in that, then steal someone from another group. Oh, they're on the screen. Never mind.